Welcome back to the Star Trek After Show, where I fire my phaser.
And I just give you the Vulcan salute.
Don't give me that
Not
sarcastic Vulcan
with...
salute.
Yeah, live long and prosper. So today we've pretty well got through the original series or TOS. If we didn't refer to it as the original series, that's what it means when we say TOS. So sorry, they all have kind of a 3-letter abbreviation for them. But what's really cool about this time is that we're heading into 1987, which is the beginning of Star Trek: The Next Generation. So this is the first time Star Trek has had a TV series on air in almost 20 years at this point. I mean, I guess if you don't count the animated series, which I don't really. But what I know of it is mainly that Gene Roddenberry had a lot of creative control towards the beginning of the show. He was very much responsible for like who the characters were, a lot of the casting process, a lot of just kind of keeping the Star Trek vision intact heading into this show. But he was not responsible for their what would eventually become a very character focused show, which is kind of years 3 through 7. So years 1 through 2, really Roddenberry is the driving force of creative control behind the show. And he kind of started to take a back seat more towards the end of that. And then, eventually passed. And Michael Piller came on to be the showrunner with Rick Berman. And Berman we can talk about Rick Berman. It may be more appropriate to talk about him during Enterprise, because I think that's when his influence is most felt.
Sure. I actually wanted to talk about Roddenberry a little bit before we got into the later seasons. But first, I have to computer load the Star Trek: The Next Generation Enterprise D bridge.
Processing.
Ah, very nice. Very nice.
It
very
is.
Comfortable seats as I'm petting the seat.
And it's so well lit.
It's very well lit.
It is
but
the best
it won't
lit
be
bridge.
In Generations.
It's true. Everybody turns down the lights because it's a movie.
And then we go into the J.J. Abrams stuff, and then it's like the lights are back on, but then they're like super bright. But
yeah,
we'll
they're
get into
so
that.
bright. Oh my gosh.
So there were a lot of behind the scenes issues with Star Trek: The Next Generation, or TNG for short. It's another one that it's kind of easier to say TNG than it is to say The Next Generation, The Next Generation.
Right.
But so, as you mentioned, Gene Roddenberry had heavy creative control, and a lot of writing staff became frustrated because he had these like standards that he wanted to follow, because this is a utopian society, and it was making it really hard to, write an episode with all of these, rules and standards that he had. And there were so many writers that quit this show, especially in the first couple seasons. I think it was like 30 writers or some crazy number, where their turnover was just ridiculous because they were always at odds with each other. And, some of them, like, when Roddenberry, started to take a lesser role, then they're like, okay, now I can start to do what I want to do. So it was kind of nice for them when, that sort of happened. But there were a lot of like, it wasn't just the rules, but it was also a lot of the contradictory rules. So he would say like, we can't have any interpersonal conflicts between regular characters. Well, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy kind of have, their own little conflicts, although they're more or less good-humored banter. So it's really not as much of like, they hate each other and they all go to their separate rooms. But, definitely McCoy on his end with all the, you could almost call them racial slurs toward Spock, like calling him a green-blooded Vulcan and all that kind of stuff.
He didn't call him Vulky, but that was, I think we
could
hear that on Enterprise, but he went like right up to that line,
Yeah. So Roddenberry also was fighting with Paramount as well, because they wanted to, make certain, they wanted to dictate certain things, and that's why he didn't go with the network TV route, because he wanted to be more independent and kind of do what he wanted to do. But there was also like, he would actually take scripts that the writers would write and he would rewrite them. And then as he started taking a back seat, there was this lawyer that he had working for him that apparently he trusted to write things for him. And this lawyer actually violated the rules and would go into the offices, steal the scripts out of people's desk drawers and rewrite them. So
wow,
it was, so I found this out like just recently, actually, while just kind of researching information about the show. And I knew that there was some kind of, it was a rocky start and some
Mhm.
issues, but that was like really surprising to me that there was actually that many, issues, and there was that kind of like violation of scripts going on. And it was very stressful for Roddenberry as well. Like his health started to decline.
Mhm.
His mood was being affected. He was drinking very heavily. Like they were actually like seeing
Mm.
him on set and through his lunch hour doing that, which
Oh,
really caused
wow.
some like broad mood swings and some confusion, even because he's just kind
Mhm.
of out of it. So it got really bad there, I think, towards the end, which was unfortunate. But then when he started to take a back seat, because he retired and kind of from the show and then passed, years later. So it's not like that,
Right.
was it for him. But I think that helped probably his personal life and the show to kind of, recover from
Yeah,
that.
did he pass in like 1990, 1991, somewhere in there? The reason I say that is because I believe once we get to Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country, it says something to the effect of dedicated to Gene
Yeah.
Roddenberry or something like that. So,
Yeah, it was right around there somewhere. I thought I had it written down, but I don't see it.
yeah.
So there were also things like Gene Roddenberry initially refused to cast Patrick Stewart as Picard. He wanted a younger captain, obviously who had some hair.
Right.
But Stewart had impressed Robert H. Justman, the producer, and he campaigned for Stewart to get cast. So Roddenberry finally relented after, Stewart was really only the one that was right for the role. Like there's
Right.
and that is just a snippet of like there are so many characters, not just in the Next Generation, but even going forward in Deep Space Nine and Voyager, where it's like we could have had an entirely different cast of
Mhm.
people, not just actors, but also characters. But certain things either worked out monetarily or worked out with producers' favor, or that sort of thing. And that's how we got the cast that we got. And it's kind of wild. Like we don't really think about
Mhm.
that when watching these shows. We're kind of just like, well, why is this character gone and what's going over here, and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. But to actually like think about this as a real world business and this kind of thing happens,
Yeah.
like, and you have characters like Counselor Troy.
Mhm.
Actually, the actress who played Tasha Yar wanted to be the Counselor Troy, and Miriam Acertus, who played Counselor Troy, wanted to play the security
Tasha Yar.
character.
Yeah,
Well,
security chief.
and she had like a different name, and
Oh, okay.
they renamed her to Tasha Yar when Denise Crosby took the role. So like
Mm.
there was a lot of this stuff too, where like the ethnicity and the name of the character and kind of what their role was different. Like Counselor Troy was actually supposed to initially be a sexually voracious four-breasted alien, and DC
That's
Fontana personally, went to Gene Roddenberry and was like, "This is ridiculous. It would take too much makeup, and it's pretty offensive." So they dropped it.
that does sound like a very Roddenberry idea. Um,
Yeah,
and so what I was going to say about Rick Berman, which he
yeah,
is going to become the standard bearer of the franchise, he gets a lot of crap from the fans, and I think rightfully so, by the over sexualization that he inserts into some of the stuff. Now, with every show that we're going to talk about up until Enterprise, someone else had co-creative control with Rick Berman. When
hmm,
we get to Enterprise, he was basically the be all end all authority of what got to end up on screen there.
yeah,
And I think that that shows when you get to that show. So I I admire Gene Roddenberry. I admire what he achieved as a creative person and sort of his vision of the future. But I'm also going to acknowledge that like he wasn't perfect. Like he definitely I don't even want to say that he wasn't anti-feminist. He was just like he was a little sexist at times.
yeah.
And I think that Rick Berman had a little bit of that too. So that maybe, they were kind of buddy buddy and stuff. But for all the crap that Rick Berman gets, he was the person that basically was handed someone else's legacy and told you have to preserve this. So
Hmm.
while I know that there was a lot of pushback against him and a lot of creative disagreements between him and other writers and other people, I do think that he was put in a really awkward position of basically defending a dead man's legacy to the network and sort of continuing that on.
Yeah. Well,
And
he
yeah,
made some good
so
decisions as
yeah,
well. Like
he did.
he's responsible for Gates McFadden coming back as Dr. Crusher
Mm-hmm.
in season 3. So initially we have Dr. Crusher. Ah, the light's too bright to see her.
Gates,
Yes, Gates
the
McFadden as
dancing
Dr.
doctor.
Crusher. So what happens is after, like when she originally signed on, it was the understanding that Dr. Crusher would eventually become a romantic foil for Captain
Mm-hmm.
Picard, but it didn't really materialize. And she, among other actors and actresses as well, were becoming increasingly frustrated with the lack of character development for the role that they were playing, and had clashes with some of the showrunners. So she actually got released from her contract, and that's why
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Pulaski, which I have here as well, played by Diana Muldaur. Muldaur?
Aha! She's transparent.
Oh, she's transparent aluminum. She's a ghost. She's a ghost. You know, I was reading a rather particularly spicy novel of a journal about a ghost.
We're not to season 7 yet.
Oh, sorry.
But
but
before, yeah, go ahead with that thought. But I have things I want to say specifically about season 1.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
before we get too far ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to finish that. Like, so we have Dr. Pulaski for a season,
Mm-hmm.
and then she decided, the actress decided, this episodic television stuff is not for me. So rather than have a third doctor come in season 3, Rick Berman personally phoned McFadden to get her back for season 3. And then she got a call from Patrick Stewart that really, you know, kind of sealed the deal from her. But we actually get, like, at the end of season 1, that Dr. Crusher took a post at Starfleet Medical, but then Pulaski comes on board, which is fine. But then when Pulaski leaves and Crusher comes back, there's no explanation. It's just like, hey, she's back. Here she is. And we never mention Pulaski pretty much ever again.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of that had to do with the reception of her character not being overwhelmingly positive either.
That too.
But well, I mean, the really biggest problem with Dr. Pulaski that I see is that, yes, they were going for kind of a Bones type character. She's kind of the older, wise, cantankerous, gruff doctor character, which I get that's what they're doing. However, they gave her the character trait of being basically racist or speciest, I guess is the word, against androids, which Data is a regular character on this show. And to the point where there's an entire episode where she's like, well, I don't think that Data can outthink this Sherlock Holmes program if it's written by a human, because he can't innovate and he can't create new things. He's only imitating things because he's just a robot, basically. And so they made that like such a character point that it was difficult to like her, because by the time you get to season 2, Data is very much a part of this show. He's definitely one of the best parts of the show. Like, he brings in humor, he brings in like that alien perspective that we had with Spock on the original series, where he's going to look at everything a little bit differently than everybody else because he's not human. And he sort of had that, Pinocchio storyline going on too, where like he wanted to be a real boy, so he wants to be more like humans and all of that. But he's one of the few characters that had character development. And when you have this newcomer coming in and kind of like crapping on him when he's the fan favorite character, I think that turned a lot of people off too, So
I think it was an important discussion that they needed to have, because they we had this whole arc with Data where it's like, we're actually taking like a trial of, is he actually a man, or is he is he Starfleet property? And I think what she brought to the show was good in terms of generating story. But just like, I guess having that character who's new come in and, crapping all over Data was just, it just was not the right fit, and made her very unlikable.
Yeah. So, what I do like about her character is that I feel like it does introduce conflict into the show that really wasn't there at all in season 1. If you look at kind of like standout episodes of season 1, you've got Encounter at Farpoint, which is the pilot, and that introduces us to Q. And that's a really important episode, because that's going to be an idea that carries through the entire Next Generation series. He shows up at least once every season. They don't really overuse him, I don't think. It's about once a year that you run into Q, but he, him being this all-powerful being, it's kind of a holdover of an idea from TOS, but we're kind of looking at it in a different light, where TOS would be running into these beings that are doing something crazy on a planet. He's like seeking out humanity intentionally, and he's being like, you guys are Neanderthals. You should not be in space. You don't deserve to be in space. And you're going to cause problems the further out you get. So I'm just going to stop you right here. Like that
So
was
I'm going
kind
to
of
cause you
Q's,
problems.
yeah, like he sought them out and had a specific agenda for like, proving why humanity was not up to the task,
Yeah.
basically. So
And
that would, yeah.
part of that was in Encounter of Farpoint, they originally were going to have the Q be a race of John Delancey playing every Q, because if you notice in the episode, he changes his clothes and his demeanor kind of changes a little bit as well from scene to scene, because originally they were going to have the whole race be him, but they scrapped that idea obviously later and just made him one entity. But it's kind of interesting, like going back to watch that episode and kind of seeing the change and being like, well, why does he seem a little bit different now? Like when he's the judge, he's just like, well, this, and you have to prove to me, and well, the court shall see. Well, what about this? He's just
he's
a little bit different.
So I think on TNG in general, they play him a little bit more menacingly than they do on Deep Space Nine and Voyager. I think when you get to those shows, they treat him a little bit more like a joke. But I think that there's always a little bit of danger behind him on the Next Generation, particularly early in the show.
It's kind of like the Joker, where it's like when you look at him at face value, you're like, this guy's the Joker, like he's a goofball, but then he's got this really serious undertone that you better watch out.
Yeah. So I guess yeah, I mean, he's one of kind of the core things that they introduced to the show. Another really big deal, honestly, with the first season of Next Generation is that they killed a major character. Like that was extremely shocking at the time. You didn't see that on TV shows very often at the time. And it's sort of the show dipping its toe into serialization without the writers even realizing that they're doing that. Because that's actually going to become an element that really carries through the rest of the Next Generation as like a story point. It's not brought up like every episode or whatever, but they're going to keep referencing the death of Tasha Yar. So yeah, I don't know. I just remember being very like shocked by that when I saw it as a kid, where I was like, oh, because I knew, the show had kind of been going for a while. And so I was watching first season in reruns, and I knew Tasha Yar wasn't there later, but I didn't know what happened to her, so.
Well, and it was more shocking at the time because it's not like now where you will binge a whole, series all in one go, or even if it's something that's being released episodically week after week, you get a little bit of that more suspense, but usually the story is continued from one episode to the next, that if you do binge it, you get this like streamlined story. Whereas TV was a lot more episodic because you could only catch it when it was on. You couldn't just on demand whenever you wanted to watch it. So you would tune in, you'd see the Next Generation, and then next week something would happen, or somebody'd be hogging the VCR, or something would happen that you wouldn't get to watch it. And then when you go to watch the episode after that, you don't want to be lost as to what's going on. So it's a new episode. They're all kind of like, maybe there's some carryover here and there, but for the most part, they're all kind of standalone episodes. And that was a big thing back then that has very much changed now, that when we look back at this, we're like, well, why didn't they carry this on, or why did they never talk about this episode ever again after it happened, like it was pretty major? Well, that's why, because there were more episodic single episodes rather than being serialized like we're used to today.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the elements that would really stick with us throughout the show are Q. The Klingons now being at peace with the Federation was a big like story point or story change from TOS. And then the Romulans sort of like moving in as the primary antagonist were those were really elements that they would be playing with for a long time throughout Next Generation. The Cardassians even as well, like late in the show's run, but that was mainly set up for their spinoff that they were developing. And then the Cardassians kind of became Deep Space Nine's problem.
And the Borg.
Yeah, that's
the Borg
true.
The Borg are huge too, which they were originally designed in their conception to be an insectoid race, but due to budgetary constraints and makeup and all that kind of stuff, it was a lot harder. So they decided to go with the cyborg thing instead.
Right.
Which was
that
really
makes
interesting.
Sense. And I guess Q is really linked to that as well, because he's the one. It's sort of his second or third attempt to talk to the Enterprise crew, where he's like, look, you guys aren't ready. he takes them to the Delta Quadrant in season 2 in the episode Q Who, and he's like, look, here's something that you can't basically diplomacy with. You can't defeat it in battle. It's going to keep coming, and there's just nothing you can do. So like maybe you guys should turn back, and
Yeah.
of course they don't, but it really introduced this unstable element into the show where and this is really the beginning of us. I wouldn't even say turning a corner away from Roddenberry's vision, but like really lurching away from it with introducing a race that like, no, you can't negotiate with them. Like there
Hmm.
is no peace with the Borg. That's
Well,
just
and
impossible.
like in Star Trek 2, where we have, the
Mhm.
Enterprise being sliced open and crew members dying, the same thing
Yeah.
happens where the Borg are just like, we don't want to reason with you. We want to conquer you or you're going to die. Let us show you the power of our technology. And they carve open a hole in the Enterprise and
Yeah.
basically just kill a bunch of people. So it's like, yeah, these guys are a serious threat, both because you can't reason with them, but also because their technology is very complex. And, the
Mhm.
Enterprise D can't just come in and wipe them out. And it's not a battle of tactics because, what tactics can you take against a
Right.
gigantic, ship that's like 10 times bigger than even the biggest Starfleet vessel that's
Mhm.
armed to the teeth? Like, but Q's like, well, if you're going to get a bloody nose and run back home, every time, whatever, the galaxy's not a safe place. So maybe you need to
Yeah.
stay out of here.
I actually like that because that's one of the few times on TNG when Q doesn't just snap his fingers and revert things back to the way they were before he showed up.
Hmm.
But he's actually just like, no, people died, and like that's what happened. Like, sorry,
And
but
it'll happen more the
this
more
is
you
what's out in
explore.
space. Like, yeah,
Yep.
I'm showing you what you're in for if you keep going into space, basically. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting turn for the series to take at that point. And but yeah, the Borg are a great antagonist, and unfortunately, maybe so great that they kind of overdo them in later shows. But I think for TNG, they kept it to where when they show up, it's an event, it's a big deal, and you like really care what's happening whenever they appear. So,
Oh yeah, for sure. So another way the Borg have influence over not just the next generation, but events happening in Deep Space Nine and beyond, and then also, well, not Star Trek Beyond, but just
mhm.
beyond Deep Space Nine, and also in Picard, the show called
Right.
Picard, is that the season 3 finale, The Best of Both Worlds, was where Captain Picard gets assimilated by the Borg and becomes Locutus. So
Mhm.
part of this story was connected to Patrick Stewart's contract negotiations because his contract for the series expired and he was giving serious consideration to not renewing it. So they would
Wow.
have killed him off in the season 4 opener or part 2 of that episode if he had not renewed his contract.
Mhm.
So that would have been a very big
That's
difference.
incredible. I wonder if
Yeah.
it was the castmates that convinced him to stay or what it was.
I didn't look far enough into it to find out, why he decided to stay on eventually. I think the thing was because there were so many issues with, production of the first 2 seasons and all the different writers and the changes. Like
Mhm.
when Patrick Stewart first came on the show, he didn't even like unpack his bags in his trailer or room or whatever because he didn't think the show was going to last. So why unpack everything if you have to pack it
Yeah.
back up? So I think that was probably just a carryover of like, I don't know if this is going to continue or not. And probably looking back, Patrick Stewart's like, I'm so glad that I decided to renew my contract.
Well, it's interesting because having seen Jonathan Frakes, who played, Commander Riker at conventions and stuff, he talked about when he was first cast, he was like, it's a steady paycheck for a year, but you can't redo Star Trek. Nobody can redo Star Trek. It's been done. It was done perfectly the way it was, and that's it. Star Trek's done. So he's
Yeah.
like, whatever, I'll try it out for a year and we'll see how it goes. And then obviously they ended up going for 7 seasons, which was much longer than the run of the original series.
Mm-hmm.
So
It
I
worked
mean,
out.
it is what it is, but there were a lot of people I think coming into this that were like, I don't think this can be done, and then they kind of were proven wrong. But a really big reason for that, I think, is Michael Piller and I've heard this from multiple people, like LeVar Burton at conventions before, and uh, you have a lot of people in Starfleet uniforms there. And Jonathan Frakes at various conventions and things have talked about how he came on in season 3 and basically saved the show. Like they were not going to make it. Oh, there's
Worf.
Worf. It is
Worf.
good to see you.
I also have Guinan.
Oh, you have Guinan.
And Geordi, but I seem to have lost his visor. And I have, of course, Data, or Data as he was originally going to be called. But then
So
Patrick Stewart, during a reading, said Data. And everybody just, well, that I guess his name is Data. And that's what it was. And then, of course, shut up, Wesley, in his Academy uniform. Anyway, so sorry.
I guess just to finish that thought, well, that's pretty much the cast right there. You've got almost everybody from TNG right there.
There, look, they're standing on the bridge.
One thing that Michael Piller did that really revolutionized the show getting made was he started accepting spec scripts, which was not done in Hollywood at the time, really. So if you're a fan, if you're somebody that watches the show, or just, it doesn't matter who you are, you can write in and send them a script, and then they will do a treatment on it and finish it, and you'll get credited. Some of these people, like I think Ronald D. Moore was somebody that had been like submitting spec scripts and then eventually became like a staff writer. So there are some of those people that like got their foot in the door that way, and then they became staff writers or went on to be really influential in some of the other shows. So that was really, I think, a good thing for the show, because it meant instead of there being just like one narrative voice, now we have a much wider variety of voices like feeding stories into the show.
Yeah.
And that really allowed them to go a lot of different directions with these characters, which, if I'm honest, are mostly defined by what their job are. So there is a big change once we're going to move away from this series, where the characters are going to have more unique points of view. But I think that Next Generation did an amazing job of telling stories about characters where, like, Geordi is blind and has a visor, and he's the chief engineer, and he's not great with women. And those are basically like his defining characteristics, like about his character. Like there's not that much to him other than that. Dr. Crusher was supposed to have that love interest thing with Captain Picard going, but they didn't really do much with it for the show. So she's kind of just like a really competent, intelligent, morally grounded doctor, and she doesn't have like a strong like character trait. And there are a lot of characters on the show like that, except for Picard and Data, who are kind of the most clearly defined. So I think that the spec scripts, and then also Michael Piller with the mandate of like, no, every episode we write, I don't care if it has a crazy sci-fi idea, it's going to be about one of the characters. Like one of them will be featured as primary in whatever like crazy sci-fi thing that we're doing. I think that really like changed it from them just sort of generating crazy sci-fi ideas to like, oh, now we actually care about these people a little bit more, and like we want to see where they go. And certainly Worf, of most of the characters, I think got more serialization than a lot of other ones, because we see him basically be kicked out of the Klingon Empire early in the show. We see how they react to him differently because he was raised by humans. And then, sort of politically trying to get a new chancellor into the Empire and all of that stuff. And who is, of course, Gowron. And you have your disruptor ready there. And then we meet Worf's brother, Kern, and, that kind of expands his lore out more, too. So I think Laura is a totally different character.
Oh, yeah.
Data's evil twin. But, I think that character focus is really what took the show from being just a mediocre sort of rehash of the original series into like, now it's its own thing. It has its own characters. Like we actually care about these people, and they're distinct from what came before. So.
And that's a really neat thing too, is like, because the original series we had Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and the focus was usually around them, with the other characters being supplemental, like a captain's log supplemental.
Yeah.
But in the Next Generation, they really tried to highlight those background characters, and even though they really didn't get rich backstories or have these, amazing character traits that were outside of their jobs, we at least started to see where we were highlighting them, and we got to see them do more than just be background characters for our main characters. So that was a nice kind of like maybe intermediary step to what we get later, which is when we get like bottle episodes of we highlight a character, we learn about their backstory and what motivates them and why they joined Starfleet and all these things that we find out in later shows that they do. So
Right. Yeah, I think it was definitely a good direction for the show to take. And
yeah.
I wanted to mention one more thing about serialization as far as Next Generation doesn't do it a lot, but I think when it does it really well. And so
Mhm.
after the Best of Both Worlds, we have this episode where Jean-Luc Picard goes back to Earth and he's basically wanting to reconnect with his family, but he's not sure if he wants to go back to Starfleet after like this horrible attack on him. And for the first time, we actually see like consequences of an event that happened
Yeah.
on Star Trek. And because again, with episodic TV, you don't really do that, but this was such a big deal that they kind of had to address it. So I think that episode, gosh, I can't think of the name of it. I think it's just called Family or something like that, where
Probably.
Picard goes home, because I think the B plot is that Worf's parents are on the Enterprise, and then the A
Mm.
plot is Picard is on the planet with his
Prune
brother
juice, a
Robert.
warrior's drink.
Yeah, exactly. With his brother
Yeah.
Robert and his nephew Rene and all that. So yeah, I think that was really instrumental too in sort of showing that like it's Star Trek, but we spent most of the time on Earth just with these characters talking to each other. And it's like, oh wow, maybe we don't need like a temporal anomaly or something to carry the show if you actually care about the people on the show. So
Hmm.
yeah, I just think that was a really like successful
Yeah.
attempt at that. So
Picking up very major events that, if you're watching the show, you have to see this two-parter.
mhm.
So it's kind of a safe bet to write another episode to reference those events because hopefully everybody's seen it. And then when you
Right.
get to like Star Trek Generations, we mention Robert and Renee again
Mhm.
and bring them up from, the show. Yeah, not in a positive way, but it was still a thread that continued from, the show into,
Right.
and then obviously Data's journey to become more of, like a human basically, or at least in his mannerisms, because he
Mhm.
still, has the android body the whole time, and he doesn't seem to want to change his android body, although we get some of that in Star Trek First Contact. So we start to see some of
Yeah.
these, concepts and ideas kind of trickle out from the Next Generation show into the movies, which we'll discuss a little bit
Yeah.
later.
Yeah, and I think the last thing, just to sort of like cap off talking about TNG, uh, or at least the last thing I really have to say about it, is that the entire cast has chemistry with each other, and
Hmm.
that really translates to the screen. You were talking about a lot of writers quit during the beginning of the show. My understanding is that they went through at least that many directors, because the cast on this show will not be serious between takes, and they were being like so goofy that it was actually like taking the directors and the camera operators and stuff like out of it, where they're like, I can't focus. But then the cameras would roll and everybody would be like, all right, I'm in character, let's do it. And they're just like, this work environment is like a madhouse. Like, who is this Jonathan
Yeah.
Frakes guy? Who is this Brent Spiner guy? Like, they're just out of control, And I mean, if you've ever seen an episode where Brent Spiner gets to go big, he goes really big. So you
Hmm.
can see that, like, that's something that he's good at and that he wants to do. So I can only
Yeah.
imagine what the shenanigans were like on the set. But these actors, like, genuinely are friends and want to spend time with each other. And I think that that comes through when you're looking at the final product on the screen. So,
Yeah, I think we see some of those trickster elements come in too, because like, so Picard, is always pulling down his uniform. And so like the
yeah.
behind the scenes, they called that the Picard maneuver, which
Mhm.
is actually a reference to something they do on the show, but it's more of, Patrick Stewart just kind of like fixing his uniform. But you have Jonathan Frakes, who is Riker, stands on a chair or next to a chair, but he has to do it like as a pirate or something like that, with his leg up, and or sitting down on a chair and just like throwing a leg over it, or stuff like that. I'm like, I bet he did that just because they were joking around about stuff
Oh
behind the
yeah.
scenes and he wanted to do something on camera, and they're like, all right, we don't want to reshoot this 20 times, just fine, if you're going to do the leg thing, fine, whatever. So we get some of those things. And then like there's this one episode, I forget what it's called. It's like the delegate or something, the diplomat. But like they're sampling all these foods from different cultures or whatever, and there's a scene change where everybody walks off the screen and you see the food of table, and then the scene changes. Well, right before the scene changes, everybody's talking, and then if you listen for it, you can hear somebody very distinctly and loudly go, "Sex." And it's like it's in the episode. Like go watch that episode. I can't remember. It's like the delegate or something, but yeah, it's so stuff like that. I'm sure there's all kinds of things that made it onto the screen that shouldn't have.
This cast specifically are really kind of known for that. So
yeah,
whatever. But it really does make the characters come to life. You care about them. So
yeah. Did you want to talk about 47?
So yeah, I guess we should. My understanding is that it was Michael Pillar's favorite number, but I'm not sure if that's accurate.
Looked it up to be sure, because that's always what I thought. But so what I found was that it was started by writer and co-producer Joe Menosky.
Joe Menosky. Okay.
Menosky.
Yeah.
So basically and then he said he picked that particular number because when he was a graduate student at Pomona College, there was a professor of mathematics that proved as a joke that all numbers are equal to 47. And 47 was also Patrick Stewart's age when Star Trek The Next Generation debuted. And then actually, so the TV series Alias in 2001 actually picked this up. So that series stars Jennifer Garner, but that also features the number 47 many times and actually incorporated it into the storyline too. So there's kind of some non-Star Trek, 47s out there too.
Well, it's definitely something to look for, starting with The Next Generation on through really every iteration of the franchise. I've seen it done on new Trek shows. I've seen it done in the Kelvin movies. Definitely all of the 90s TV shows are very regular with it. Voyager probably being the most obvious with it. It's usually spoken aloud on Voyager.
Or sometimes you get 7-4, but it instead of 4-7, but it's like it's in some of the registry numbers, like the USS Voyager is NCC 74656, and then they make reference to a species called species 8472, and then it's also like how many people were we able to beam out? Oh, we only got 47 of them. But then it's also on like the display screens, and like if you can see them. In the scenes, or just written on a pad, or just something, like all kinds of stuff. But there's also, like, in addition to 47, they would put nonsensical things on the displays that you couldn't see.
Backwards.
Oh yeah.
I was gonna say I have a 47 tattoo, but it's backwards.
I think it's backwards because your mirror video is mirrored to you, but it's not
is mirrored
to us.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good.
But like it's so they would put nonsensical things, like they have like these pipes, and it says like GNDN, goes nowhere, does nothing. Or they would have like they actually have a hamster on a wheel on the technical readout of the Enterprise D, but you can't see it because it's so small that you can't see that detail on camera. But they snuck all these different kinds of jokes in addition to the 47 in a lot of the visuals and stuff that you really just can't see unless you're on set.
Yeah, I mean, Cetacean Ops would have been another one. The door on the Enterprise D that leads to cetacean operations. I think that was supposed to be a reference to Star Trek 4. And then when we got to Lower Decks, they just really ran away with it. So
yeah. But there are no bathrooms. So they actually, I think it was James Doohan eventually said, like, well, in the future, they don't need bathrooms. That's what phasers are for.
Oh my god! You just vaporize it.
Yeah, but they made a joke that there's like no bathrooms anywhere, so they don't really do that, I guess, because you never see anyone on Star Trek coming from a restroom or using it, or you never see a door that's, hey, I'm gonna go to this room. Oh, okay, don't follow me, or nothing. It's just they never make reference to it.
It's never a thing. I don't know. It's very unusual, but there's no.
I gotta go to waste extraction.
Apparently, that's the only mention of it in Star Trek that I'm aware of.
Maybe it's dilithium waste. Maybe it's something. Well, it's Cardassian though, so the Cardassians maybe they can have bathrooms.
Maybe they do.
They probably go out of their necks or something. Anyway, That should
So
wrap up the Next Generation, right?
yeah, so while the Next Generation was happening, the original series movies were still going.
Hmm.
So in 1989, when TNG is in season 2, we have Star Trek V: The Final Frontier. And
And a laughing Vulcan. Okay.
and a laughing Vulcan named Cybok. That's right. And I think, or I have a suspicion, that Star Trek V: The Final Frontier happened because William Shatner was not real thrilled that Leonard Nimoy had been able to direct 2 Star Trek movies. And so now this one, William Shatner gets to direct and write.
And is
So
regarded as possibly the worst Star Trek movie out of all of them.
so I don't know that I would disagree with that, but I feel like it has a lot of good moments, even though
Yeah,
like the middle of the movie is not
mostly at
great.
the beginning.
Yeah, it's mostly at the beginning, but the character relationships still ring true to me, the way that the crew interacts with each other. And honestly, when if I'm gonna rewatch Star Trek V, it's just because watching these characters interact with each other is very charming.
Hmm.
And like seeing Kirk, Spock, and McCoy together again, but they're on shore leave, and like, what do? Well, they talk about work, and then Dr. McCoy complains about Kirk taking too many risks, and you know,
Yeah.
and Spock is there trying to understand the meaning of row, 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 row your
Row,
boat,
row, row,
and
row. Well, and
and
that's the thing too. Is like you get all
yeah,
of this humor, like we had in
mhm,
Star Trek 4, the one with the whales. But
right,
instead of being overtly, "Hey, this is a humorous movie," it's a lot more serious movie. But we
it
have this
is.
undercurrent of humor, and I don't know if that's partially what ruins it, because the serious parts don't seem as serious, and you're just like, this doesn't really seem like a big deal. But there is a lot of like really funny humor that's
Hmm.
banter between the characters that I really enjoyed. And if I had to pick one between the serious story and the humorous banter, I would watch Star Trek V for the
Oh
humorous
yeah,
banter all day
yeah,
long. So
yeah. It's definitely entertaining for that reason. I mean, they do have a really odd sort of. It's not even a B story. It's like a C or a D story where like Uhura is dating Scotty apparently, and I don't know what's going on with that. But it's only in this movie, and then they immediately drop it afterwards.
mhm.
So I don't know why that was something that they felt the need to include, but what they do story wise with Cybok is at least interesting. I just don't know that it was a movie scale problem
Yeah,
necessarily.
true.
It's because basically he's a Vulcan that has rejected all of the logic and he embraces his emotions, and he's also Spock's half brother. So he has a different mother than Spock, but
Yeah.
Sarek is his father. So I guess all of Sarek's kids were disappointments. I don't know. Because Cybok definitely was not the kind of child that Sarek would want.
Yeah.
But we do get some good character moments in the movie. I just feel like maybe the stakes don't quite reach
Hmm.
what they do in some of the other films, and that may be what holds it back. Also, and there's a book out there that William Shatner has written called Star Trek Movie Memories, where he talks about like his memories making the movies. He says that when the effects shots started to come in for this movie, that they looked terrible. And apparently, Industrial Light and Magic was stretched thin, and they were working on like multiple other projects. And Star Trek Five was kind of like an afterthought. So like they had a totally different ending sequence planned, where like the god creature that they meet at the end of the movie was going to create these giant rock monsters that came after them on
Oh
the
yeah.
planet, and like all of this stuff, and all of that was cut because they were like, well, the shots of the shuttle flying by look fake, so we're not going to do all of that. And
That
it's
I actually heard one of the characters on, I think it's Star Trek Prodigy, was based on the fact that they didn't get to do their rock monsters, and so they have a like
oh
rock character
wow,
on that.
that's
I
interesting, I
remember
didn't
reading that
know that.
recently. I also forgot that I need to computer load Star Trek Original Series Movie Bridge. There we go.
There you go. That is very much the Undiscovered Country. Actually,
Yeah.
what that looks like is either that might look like the Excelsior, actually, from the
Hmm.
Undiscovered Country. I'm not sure.
It
But
does. Why
one
would you
thing
want that old bucket of bolts?
that's a good come now. What is it? New minds, fresh ideas, be tolerant.
Something
Um,
like that.
Be tolerant.
I want the Excelsior. Why would you want that old bucket of bolts off your shaft?
That's
Humor
another good
continues.
segue into continuing to talk about Star Trek V, because at this point, so after every Star Trek movie, they scrap the bridge set, because they were like, every Star Trek movie, they're like, this will be the last one
This
that
is
we
it.
ever make.
Yeah.
And so the bridge set changes in like every single movie, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Even so bad as like the bridge at the end of Star Trek 4, when they get the USS Enterprise A, is not the same as the bridge on the Enterprise A in Star Trek 5. And they only showed it for one scene at the end of that movie, and it's still different.
It could have been
So,
easily explainable because this is a different ship. So
right.
obviously the bridge could look differently, but they didn't. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what I actually found out when I was digging is that they repurposed a lot of Next Generation sets to work on Star Trek 5. So
and vice versa.
Yeah, and vice versa, exactly. So they were kind of, recycling elements so that they could not spend as much money, basically. But
yeah,
I think Star Trek 5 ultimately, it plays with some cool ideas. I don't know, going to the center of the universe and meeting a deity that represents a being from like all these different planets, faiths. Like, that was interesting, but the effects were not there, and really they just didn't put the money into it that it needed to like really realize that visually in an exciting way.
yeah.
And also the third act gets a little bit silly, where like, Spock takes command of the Klingon bird of prey, and he's on the planet, and he points the thing at Kirk's head, and then Kirk sees him, and he starts to like tear up, and he's hugging him, and Spock's like, not in front of the Klingons. And it's like, all right, like, would he really say that? Like that, and Scotty hitting the pipe, hitting his head on the pipe.
I know this ship like the back of my hand. Bonk.
Bonk.
Like, would Scotty really do that?
Would it was funny, but I don't think he would.
Well, and we have the scenes where they're confronting that, entity thing where it's like a giant head, kind of like Zordon on the Power Rangers.
Oh yeah, very much.
But, everybody's just like all like, oh my gosh, this is like God or something. And Kirk's just like, I don't think it is. And so it's like, bring the starship closer that I may join with it. And Kirk's like, excuse me, what does God need with a starship? And McCoy's just like, Jim, you don't ask the Almighty for his ID. I think that was one of the best moments of the the second half of the movie.
It is.
Like, it's goofy and funny, but entertaining too.
Yeah, it is entertaining. It's one of those movies where I kind of accept that it's not like a high benchmark for Star Trek, but I do still get enjoyment out of it.
Yeah.
And Jerry Goldsmith comes back for the first time.
Oh yeah.
To do the score in this. And what you'll find, especially in the latter half of the score, is that a sort of proto version of his First Contact theme is being used while they're traveling on the planet. So this is very much like part of the musical evolution of Star Trek, is like Jerry Goldsmith's sound that's going to continue throughout all the next gen movies is very much maturing into what it's going to be later with this movie.
Because we get kind of the original series theme and the next generation Star Trek theme, and then we have like an additional movie theme that adds like a whole nother section to that original theme. So yeah, it's very much an illusion, very much an evolution of that theme, that when it gets to the movies, it feels a lot more grandiose than it did in the TV shows. And I think that's excellent for making the transition from TV to movie. Is it feels a lot larger, it feels a lot bigger, and that really helps make it feel like a movie. And even in those days, it's like we've graduated from this network TV show to something very serious that's on the big screen. Like, it seemed like more of a big deal than today with, movies being streamed easily, and you don't really even have to go to the theater anymore. It's not as big of an event as it used to be. So but back then, hearing that Star Trek theme was just like, oh, we're in the movies, we're especially us, I think, growing up too, it was like we were becoming adults, and it's like, I'm maturing, I'm getting older, and Star Trek is maturing and getting more refined, and it's like we're growing together.
It very much was like a formative part of my growing up experience. So, and I don't know that I was watching TNG or like the Final Frontier when it was new. But the next movie that comes up, The Undiscovered Country, is actually one of the first Star Trek movies that I saw, believe it or not. I think I'd maybe seen Wrath of Khan before, but this is that was one of the first Star Trek movies that I had seen. And that's a pretty crazy place to start the movies
Yeah.
because it's the end of the original series, really.
Well, and it's definitely a little it's very different, I think, than a lot of the
Hmm.
movies before it. And especially going from the Final Frontier that was like, trying to be serious but had all of these humorous undertones. Now we're
Hmm.
just like, okay, this is very serious. We're doing something
Yeah.
very serious here. And this definitely feels like a movie scale plot that we're going
Hmm.
through. And there's all this stuff happening, and it's a lot more, mature in the sense of,
Hmm.
1991, as mature as you can kind of get with those kinds of
Sure.
movies. But it felt like like we had moved up to this point, and now we're kind of, ditching the humor and kind of looking back
Yeah.
more, that kind
And
of
it
thing.
it I think Undiscovered Country has humor, but I think it's much more understated. And I think
Yeah.
that was definitely intentional of them not wanting it to take over the storyline. But it's Nimoy was one of the co-writers on it. I don't believe he was the primary writer. I think it was Nicholas Meyer, but they kind of worked on the script together with several other people and came up with the idea of sort of bringing the relationship between the United States and Russia into the Star Trek universe,
Mm.
and sort of the idea of like America and Russia having to make peace with each other, and these people that grew up being in conflict with each other now having to adjust to that peacetime. And so it's very much a transitional movie that brings us from the original series to the Next Generation era. Because in Next Generation, the Klingons and the Federation are at peace, you know. But in the original series, they've been not at war, but it's been like we don't cross into their territory, they don't cross into ours. And Kirk has a very personal gripe because they killed his son.
Yeah.
Like they literally killed his son. So this is it's like a political thriller in a lot of ways. There are assassinations, there is like conspiracies of Starfleet and Romulans and Klingon officers working together, which of course is the irony to keep their governments from having peace. And so it really has a lot of like real world things coming into it, especially with the scene where Kirk is on trial and General Chang, the Klingon general, shouts at him like, "Don't wait for the translation. Answer me now." That was something from the Bay of Pigs incident with the Russians in like the '60s with President Kennedy that actually happened at the United Nations. Like I don't know if it was the Russian ambassador, but it was somebody that was like, "Don't wait for the translation. Answer me now." Like yelled it. Like that was
Huh.
actually taken from like a real world event, and then they just like put it in the movie. So it's
Wow.
very much like intended to mirror that like uneasy time of like, okay, we're at peace. How do we like adjust our mindsets to this? And also, I don't think this would have happened while Gene Roddenberry was alive, but Kirk is like openly racist in the beginning
Yeah.
of the movie. Um, Now he goes on a journey in the movie where he sort of starts to recognize his own bias and prejudice by the end of it. But they actually allowed that character to have something that wasn't perfect about him, which I think was a big deal. So,
Hmm. The music was also a lot more serious
oh
too. Like we have a
man.
different composer, a different theme, and it's very unique to this movie. Like we don't really explore it again. So it
Hmm.
really makes this movie almost kind of like stand alone, as if it's something, very different from what we've had previously, both in tone and then also, with the music and the plot, and less on the humor. So it really feels like it's kind of this bookend, I guess you could say,
Hmm.
to the original series movies.
Yeah, it's definitely a good ending point because the Klingons have been really kind of the overriding threat for the original series years.
Hmm.
And we know that that's going to be moonlit as they head into the future because Next Generation's already running. So we know that
Right.
those two governments are no longer in conflict with one another. But I think it was really smart to look at it and go, our characters on this show might not be able to just flip a switch and be okay with that. Like they
Yeah.
might have to adjust and it might be hard. And it deals with aging, I think, as all the original series movies do, but I think it deals with it a little more intelligently than some of the other movies where it's not talking about them getting older. It's more about like, are their attitudes inflexible? Are they not able to adapt? Are they, gonna be able to survive this new era that's coming, the undiscovered country, the future, you know?
Hmm.
And so I think that that is a really cool way to sort of send off this cast, is to give them, they have like a really big heroic adventure that they go on where they end up, saving the Federation president and actually saving the new chancellor of the Klingon Empire in the process. But the characters are conflicted about it, and it really feels more, I guess, nuanced is the word, as far as like the character motivations, and especially like Kirk himself. And
Yeah.
I really enjoy the moment where he's like in prison at the beginning of the third act, where he's like, he's talking to Dr. McCoy
And he meets Martia.
with Martia. Yes, in the prison. There's Martia. Oh my god. Yeah, when he's in prison and he's talking to Dr. McCoy and he's like, I it never occurred to me to take the Klingons at their word. Like
Hmm.
that was never a thought that I had. So like once he has time to like sit and think about it, he's like, wow, like they actually weren't up to no good. And I thought they were. Like, and
Yeah.
that's, that's like a really big turning point for him and also for the movie. So
Yeah, I think that was a lot of the difficulty in, not just Roddenberry's, utopian rules or whatever,
mhm.
but, trying to have this advanced society, and the whole message of Star Trek being, humanity's made it. Like, this is a positive
Right.
version of, we've left all of our prejudices, we've left poverty, we've left
Mhm.
sickness all behind, and we have Starfleet that is basically a utopia. Like, Earth is a utopia, and they make reference
Yeah.
to this a lot. But how do you, as a writer, write these stories and conflicts and things from that perspective, because we don't know what it's like here on this earth, and we're kind of
Right.
limited by what we can write here to make these episodes. So you almost have to introduce these kinds of conflicts like
Mhm.
racism and prejudice in order to have a story to be able to talk about. But I think that the Undiscovered Country did it in a smart way, because we're piggybacking off of the Wrath of Khan, where
Right.
Kirk really, it really feels like he has a reason to hate the Klingons because of what they did to his son. But also, every time he's encountered them, they've always been antagonistic, and they've never
Right.
really wanted to talk peace. They've never really wanted to sit down and have a chat. They're just like savage beast people almost,
Yeah.
especially in Kirk's eyes. And so it's like, you're sending Klingon diplomats and, all of this stuff, but, you know, are these people really even capable of this? And having him go through that journey of learning to accept it,
Mhm.
presents that real world thing of, veterans coming back from war, seeing these people that they had to kill or be killed, and now we're all friends. Like, how do you get over
Right.
something like that? Like,
Yeah.
I can't even imagine. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think it feels more real than a lot
yeah.
of the other things that are done with the original series
And that's what
characters.
Star Trek does well, I think, is bringing
Yeah.
those real elements in
Mhm.
and showing them in a science fiction way, but really making you think about it like, well, this
Right.
happens in real life. Like, how do people deal with this?
Mhm. Yeah, and I guess I should say it wasn't completely one-sided in Undiscovered Country either. There were plenty of Klingons as well that were
Oh,
like, "I don't
yeah.
want anything to do with these humans,"
Kirk? No, get him out of
And
here.
yeah, um, but I think for that reason, just how, like, nuanced it is and everything, Undiscovered Country is probably my favorite of the original 6, Star Trek movies. I just really like how intelligently it's able to like articulate its points while also being a really exciting like action spectacle. And I think where
Mhm.
it ends is in a place of hope too, because it's like
Yeah.
at the end, Kirk is the one that delivers the speech that's like, it's about the future. And like people are afraid of the future because it's going to look different than what came before. But like we're learning to navigate that basically. And it's really cool and I think feeds into that hopeful message of Star Trek to see someone overcome that attitude within themselves and be like, "You know what? Like actually I was wrong. Like this
Yeah.
is we do need to go a different way." So,
Well, and especially in the next couple of years following this movie, where the next generation ends, and now we get
mhm,
even new Star Trek shows that are very different from the original series
right.
and the next generation, and we go in a different direction. And Voyager is especially exploring the undiscovered country. So that's a nice theme that carries into the next couple of years of Star Trek as well.
Yeah, for sure.
So before we get to Voyager, we have to obviously talk about Deep Space Nine, or DS9, which ran from 1993 to 1999. So another 7-year journey, which was really, awesome at the time, because we had, when we had the original series, it only got, 3 years, and then we had some really awesome movies. But now it's like we had the Next Generation for 7 years, we had Deep Space Nine for 7 years, and then we'll have Voyager after this for 7 years. And so we get a lot of good content. But Deep Space Nine, very uniquely so, is a different setting, because as the title implies, we are actually on a space station, and it's about a lot of the political stuff that happens that around the station. And although it does move at the beginning, it
In
really
the
doesn't
pilot, yeah.
it doesn't like actually travel anywhere. And then eventually we'll get to the point where we have a ship, but it's not about exploration and seeking out new life and new civilizations like we had in the original series and the Next Generation. It's quite a different show.
Yeah, so I think Deep Space Nine tends to split the fan base a little bit. And I think
Yeah.
that mostly people have accepted it now, especially in the post-streaming era. But when it first aired, it was the lowest rated Star Trek show, particularly in the later seasons when it got more serialized. And that's funny, because that means that the show itself has actually not aged as much as some of the other ones, because it feels more like modern storytelling. Because the writers realized somewhere after like season 2 that they're like, we really can't write off problems at the end of an episode, because our characters are still here. They haven't moved. They haven't gone anywhere. They're not like going away from whatever the planet was last time. Like, they're still in the same place. So they started to really lean into doing more serialization. And there's a lot of themes that we can talk about here. I mean, the biggest topics that they talk about are like sort of wartime politics, sort of the aftermath of war, which is where the series starts, and then actually what it looks like to see Utopia go into a war, which is where the series ends. And there are actually episodes that revolve entirely around non-human characters for the first time. So like there are some episodes where it's just the Ferengi characters. Like they're the main focus. Like you're going to see some of the humans on the station, but they're not the featured player. Like Quark is going to get his own episode, or Nog is going to get his own episode. And even people like Garrick, who are technically guest stars, will basically get featured episodes where they're going to be primary. So this show does not have the biggest main cast of all the shows. That's actually Voyager that has the largest main cast of any of them. However, this show has way more recurring guest stars than any of the other shows. And I think a lot of that comes from just they can't go anywhere. So you're going to start running into the same people. Like that's going to make sense.
People are going to come to visit instead of you going to visit them.
Yeah. So it's, it's very much, it's a more politically charged show. We really get into the Bajorans, which are a race that are introduced on Next Generation, and they get developed as a society. The Cardassians get developed as a society. The Ferengi do. We even see more. Yeah, there's Kira Nerys, the first officer, Deep Space
She's Bajoran. You can't see her nose ridges because my light's too bright. I apologize.
Yeah, but they just got the little...
For some reason, she's the only DS9 figure I have, and I have no idea why. I decided to get Kira and nobody else, but...
Oh, well, she's an awesome character, so...
Yeah.
That makes sense. But yeah, it's definitely... You pretty well, when you start with Deep Space Nine, you can watch the first 2 seasons, and they made a similar mistake that Next Generation did. So, except it's kind of like a later version of that same mistake. But Next Gen started off and they were like, let's riff on TOS episodes and what worked on TOS. And so that's kind of how Deep Space Nine starts, which that's not how the pilot is. But after the pilot, they kind of like drop all the concepts that were like laid out in the pilot. And they start doing these episodic things where like, well, something new comes through the wormhole to the station every week. And what crazy thing will it be?
What will come out next?
But yeah, but I think like very quickly they realized that like, okay, this doesn't actually make sense. And we can't have our show be about space exploration if it's not moving anywhere. So,
but we can introduce weird things like Calamarine and count to 10 and Dalamarine and or whatever that was. They had some weird episodes.
Move along
Yeah.
home. Yeah, so go ahead, sorry.
I was gonna say I completely forgot because I'm still sitting here in the original series movies, but
Oh,
computer
yes.
load operations from Deep Space Nine. So another very distinct thing is not only are we on a space station, but we are on a Cardassian space station. So we are not on a Starfleet ship. So it's kind of like two things that are, very different. But as you were saying about, concepts being introduced from the Next Generation, one really awesome concept that they released pretty much simultaneously on Deep Space Nine, the Next Generation, and Voyager were the Maquis, which is something that was very against, Roddenberry's values and ideals, because, these guys are basically Starfleet officers who say, we don't like what Starfleet's doing. We're going to have, mount an insurrection, and no, not the movie Insurrection, but we're going to break away, and we don't like how these other people are being treated, and we don't think Starfleet is living up to it. So we're going to break away and become separatists, like in Star Wars, basically. But
well, I mean, and there, it's interesting to have that in. I just wanted to like interject real quick, in a post-scarcity world, because they can't have a reason to leave that's like, oh, we don't have enough food or something like that, because everyone has enough food in this Star Trek utopian future. However, what they do lose, because the Federation signs a treaty, is that suddenly the planets that they live on are no longer inside Federation space.
Yeah.
So now they're part of the Cardassian Empire, and they can either get off those planets or, no longer be a part of the Federation. And that's where their disconnect comes in, where it's basically like, the same old thing of like a politician signing something into law really far away on Earth, not realizing how it's affecting people that are like way out there. So the deep space part of the show is really like, yes, we're in the utopia. Yes, like that perfect world exists, but we're way out here far away from it. So like sometimes
frontier medicine.
Frontier medicine, exactly.
Real
Dr.
frontier
Bashir
medicine.
says.
Yeah. That frontier is my home, doctor.
There are a lot of good lines even in the opening episode, but so the Maquis are very much this group that are just like, we've just been told that we can't live on our homes anymore. Like, yeah, they're colonists on these planets, but the Federation is saying like, well, you got to get out of there because Cardassia is going to come like conquer it soon, basically. Yeah. And they're like, no, we're going to start like firing on Starfleet ships and fighting for our right to party, to stay on this planet. And so that's where the conflict comes in, and you have people that are they're starting to question like, maybe what the Starfleet does isn't right all the time. And so I don't think that ever would have been done while Gene Roddenberry was alive, but
it was a very smart way to introduce conflict without taking away from the core of the show and those concepts, because we're basically saying that, Starfleet, not that they did something wrong or it's the wrong decision, but it's like, it's a political decision that, just kind of happened, unfortunately. And there wasn't, because of red tape and everything, there wasn't really anything that Starfleet could do, because they're bound to their rules and laws and directives and that kind of thing. But at the same time, recognizing, like you mentioned, and they actually bring this up in the episode, is that, the people making this decision from Starfleet are on Earth, which is a utopia. So when they go visit these other planets that are definitely not up to the standards of Earth, they're, not a utopia whatsoever, they're not making clear decisions because they don't know how to think in those terms, because they're so used to living in the utopia. And I think that was a very smart way to introduce conflict, because it's just the way that Starfleet thinks is they're not, expecting that there's these planets that are going to be affected by this, and there's not much they can do anyway, because they had to sign this treaty to make peace with the Cardassians, which are a very serious threat. And it was the right decision. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one in this case. And the Maquis are like, hey, I get that, but at the same time, this is very personal to me, because I have friends, family, loved ones, or I came from there or whatever, and I'm not going to stand for this. So if Starfleet can't do anything, then I'm going to take the law into my own hands, and I'm going to become a vigilante. I'm going to become something else. to quote
Cue the arrow
Arrow.
theme.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it is. It's a great concept, and it's interesting that Deep Space Nine inherited it because they were very much not intended to have the show be about the Maquis. That was
Hmm.
really supposed to be Voyager's thing because half of their crew on Voyager is Maquis.
Yeah.
But what happened was because that show doesn't take place with the regular Star Trek races and where, you know, basically where the Enterprise had been, Deep Space Nine kind of became the standard bearer for the franchise in that part of space because they're like, well, now we have the Star Trek universe basically on this show
Yeah.
because Next Generation has ended and Voyager is somewhere totally else, in space. So we're the
They're not
ones telling
affected
you
by
what's
what's
going
going
on
on.
with the Klingons and the Romulans and all of that. So they did start to really lean into serialization, and a lot of that was because the ratings weren't good, and so honestly the network execs were not paying attention to them, so they were like, oh, we can do crazy things and nobody's going to stop us because they're not watching the show anyway. So it's funny because I think that the actual like just craftsmanship of the stories and the character arcs and all of that stuff feels so intentional and so smart on this show that you wouldn't believe that they didn't plan it that way ahead of time. But it really is just a product of like they were given the tools to be creative and they were allowed to just kind of run with it and they didn't have a lot of oversight. And I
Hmm.
think that's one reason why Deep Space Nine turned out as well as it did,
Yeah.
So
Well, and to compare what they did, which was kind of look back and say, okay, we did these things. How can
mhm.
we, not retcon, but kind of like Star Wars, where it's like we're going to expand this idea and pick it
Right.
up. And it looks like they had the idea all along, like, Dr. Bashir being genetically engineered. But that was something that they came up with later and introduced that
Mhm.
if you watch the first couple seasons before they revealed that, for the most part, I'd say 95, 99%, everything seems consistent with that, with him hiding that. There's a couple of
Yeah.
things here and there where like, I don't know that that fits, but it fit overall really well. But you compare that to something like Babylon 5, which that whole,
Right.
5-year story arc was essentially written out from the beginning. But it's funny because there was a lot of animosity there because DS9 was doing what Babylon 5 was doing, but also, not on top of that, Paramount Pictures had actually rejected J. Michael Straczynski's proposal of Babylon 5 to them in the late 1980s.
Oh,
But they
wow.
used certain details of the pitch by inserting them into the story and premise of this show. So it was
Right.
kind of like, okay, are you stealing from this even though you rejected it? That's not exactly right. But
Yeah.
it's funny though because we have like Majel Barrett who played Luoxana Troy on The
Mhm.
Next Generation and on Deep Space Nine and played number one in the pilot.
Mhm.
Basically, she starred on an episode of Babylon 5 as an alien prophetess, and she
I
was talking
forgot
about,
about that.
yeah, so that was kind of neat to see, like we almost had like a little crossover there. And she
Mhm.
kind of speaks that she has a recently deceased husband, which at that time
Mhm.
Roddenberry had passed away like a couple years before she was on that episode. So it was kind of like a nice nod of like, hey, Babylon 5,
Yeah.
Star Trek, they're different. Maybe DS9 borrowed from Babylon 5, but they're both really good shows and
Right.
we're all cool. We're all cool.
Well, I was gonna say the other element, and I was just reminded of this when because briefly talked about Voyager with the Maquis. The way that they brought conflict into this show without breaking the premise was they were like, okay, the Starfleet characters will get along with each other, but half the crew on this station is Bajoran, so
Hmm.
they report to Major Kira basically. Even though Commander Cisco in the beginning, or later Captain Cisco, is the commander of the station, Kira is really their ranking officer in a way. So like they almost have two crews that are trying to like commingle and coexist. And the interests of the Bajoran people are not always the same as what like Starfleet would want. And I actually it's interesting because when I was watching the show, I thought, oh, I want to see Bajor join the Federation. But after having seen it a few times, I actually think it was really smart of the writers to be like, no, they're not necessarily compatible and they don't need to be a part of this giant interplanetary thing. Like, not everyone wants to do that.
Hmm.
And so, again, if this were written in the Next Generation era, that would probably be the end game. But you get to the end of Deep Space Nine, and Bajor still hasn't joined.
Yeah.
So it's like they're still just like, we're working together with you, but we don't know if we want to be a part of your Federation. So
Mhm.
I
Well,
don't
and
know.
they should have those kinds of levels where it's like,
Hmm.
you join as a partner, like, hey, you are in the United Federation, or you join as an alliance to where you
Right.
don't have to take on the ideals and have Starfleet and have all of that replace. You get to still maintain your own entity, but we are very much aligned that we will support each other, kind of more than just like a peace treaty that can be broken,
Right.
at any time. But yeah, kind of interesting that we go some different directions, but we also do it in a smart way to where it's like, our Starfleet people are still holding these ideals. It's the rest
Hmm.
of the galaxy that, we have to
Right.
deal with them, and they are very much like the old way that humanity used to be. So how do we, kind of
Right.
reconcile that? But
Yeah.
some other things that Deep Space Nine inherited from the Next Generation. So when the Enterprise D was originally being designed, the producers actually wanted to have the transporter room directly off the main bridge, but Gene Roddenberry said, no, I want to have characters be able to have conversations in the turbolifts before and after they embark in a mission. So
Mm.
they moved the transporter room further away so they could have those. But on Deep Space Nine, operations on the Cardassian station has this element of the transporter being built into the main set. And there were some
Hmm.
other rejected ideas that they had on the Enterprise too, which were an upper level office. So Cisco has like an upper level office that he goes to, whereas the main area is kind of sunken down, and then having a briefing table in the center of the room. So this is very different
Yeah.
from the original series of The Next Generation, where, hey, we need to have a conference, even though, something crazy is happening. Let's retreat back to the conference room, put the
Right.
ensign in charge while the Klingons are literally pointing their, torpedoes and disruptors and everything at us. Hey, we'll be right back. We're going to go talk in the back room, get some snacks, maybe use the bathroom that doesn't exist. But
Right.
on Deep Space Nine, it's very much like we're all here at the briefing table, at this war table. And if
Yeah.
somebody's threatening us, we're looking at the view screen, we put them on mute, we have our conversation here, we can go do something about it. If we need to transport somewhere real quick, we can do that because it's all just kind of in that central hub. So that
Yeah.
was another big change from the previous shows, and I think really worked for the show and kind of made it feel like it was a little more geared towards action rather than sort of the
Yeah.
slow paced, let's discuss and then come back that they did before.
And there is a lot of action on Deep Space Nine, and you're making my thought process is kind of, my gears are kind of turning now, thinking about, why do I love the action on Deep Space Nine, but I don't love it on some of the newer Trek shows. And I think what it is that even when they go all in for action on Deep Space Nine, it feels like it has consequences, and it feels like it's happening because of the characters always. I
It's
don't feel like,
servicing the story
yeah,
rather
there's
than
not,
being the main attraction.
right. There's not an episode of Deep Space Nine that I can think of, at least, where we're just blowing stuff up just for the entertainment value of it. It's always like, even episodes like Valiant, where like Nog and Jake are on that Red Squad ship that's like
Hmm.
going around just blowing up Dominion ships all over the place. It's like, well, that story is about how these cadets were like promoted too soon, and they kind of lost control, and they're just out here doing like rogue missions, and people are getting killed. And so it was about them, and sort of like dealing with the command structure breaking down and things like that. It had action in it, but that wasn't the main point of it, I guess. So
Yeah.
even in the wartime episodes, I don't feel like it's superfluous to the story. It's like, oh, cool, this is a really exciting action sequence, and you care about it more because you really care about the characters when you're going into it. So,
Yeah. And
yeah.
it was the first time that I can recall ever seeing a gigantic fleet of
Mm-hmm.
ships and also a gigantic space battle where there's just like ships on both sides. I mean, like
Mm-hmm.
we've had a lot of battles in Star Wars, but there were a lot of fighters. and then there were the really gigantic, Star Destroyers. But here it was like a lot of the ships were around the same size, and while there were some fighters, they were all kind of like the medium to large class ships,
Yeah.
and they were all, of Star Trek design, and we hadn't really seen anything like that before. So seeing it on Deep Space Nine, like, was so amazing at the time. Like, now it's
Yeah.
aged and doesn't look quite as good, but at the time it was very mind-blowing, at least for me. So
Well, yeah, I think it might be season 3 of Deep Space Nine was when they really made the shift to like, okay, we can't use models for all of this anymore
yeah.
because the scope of what we're trying to do is too big to build models. And it's the episode where Garrick is basically tempted to rejoin the Obsidian Order, and Odo's with him, and they go to the Founders' homeworld, and they're like, "How many ships are there?" And she goes, "Oh, 175." And then they show like outside the ship, and there's just like hundreds of Jem'Hadar fighters like everywhere. That was the moment where I was like, "Oh my gosh! Like, what are they doing on this show?" So
Yeah.
it's really the fact that they weren't getting good ratings is amazing because it looked like they were the most expensive Star Trek show at the
Well, and
time,
if they were going to do
for
that today,
sure.
it certainly would have been. But
Mhm.
in the mid to late 90s, I guess it wasn't quite, because it was still so
Yes.
new. Maybe it wasn't so expensive, but
Yeah,
I don't
maybe.
know. So I did read something about Avery Brooks, who plays Captain
Oh,
Sisko.
yeah.
He actually was like, he shaved his head bald and he had a goatee,
Mhm.
and kind of like they did with the Next Generation, they were like, well, we want to have a captain who has hair, and we're serious about it this time. So Avery Brooks had to actually shave his goatee and let his hair grow
Mhm.
out to play this part. And then finally, after a couple of seasons, they let him look like, the actor look like he actually does in real life, and not have to, you know, grow
Yeah.
out his hair and shave his goatee. Now he could shave his head and grow out his goatee, the opposite. So it was kind of weird. Like, in the show, he's just like, yeah, you like it, that kind of thing. And it was like
Yeah.
just a change he made, and then we kind of just move on. But behind the scenes, it was probably really exciting for the actor to be like, I don't have to go through this extra stuff anymore.
Yeah. It's, I think he's a very different type of captain than we've seen on the previous shows because Kirk is, kind of the shoot from the hip guy. He's kind of the space cowboy. And but again, he's very, very intelligent. That's definitely a part of his character as well.
Hmm.
Picard is the consummate diplomat. He's the guy that's always going to make the right decision. There's not room for a lot of moral gray in Picard. Whereas Captain Cisco seems willing to bend the rules a few times and enter
Yeah.
into those sort of gray moral solutions to things. And I think that that fits with the tone of this show because it's very much about, not even just with the Maquis or with the Bajorans, but even with like the Dominion being sort of like the anti-federation, where they're the federation that forces you to join. Where they're
Yeah.
like, you have to be a part of our organization of races because we conquered you and now you're under the Dominion banner. Um, it's a lot of just kind of pushing back against that sort of like black and white worldview of like Starfleet is always good and the other people are always bad kind of thing. Like it's more nuanced, like we said
Hmm.
before. And I think Cisco fits that really well where he is definitely a Starfleet officer. He's a very like principled man. He's definitely somebody that's always going to do the right thing. But because he's looking over this entire like sector of space and not just one ship, sometimes he has to make decisions that affect a lot more people than just like, well, who's on the station. It's like, well, how is this going to affect the planet Bajor? How's it going to affect our relationships with the Cardassians who are nearby? And
Hmm.
all of this stuff, and especially once they get into the war, like, how am I gonna, well, the most controversial episode, how do I get these casualty reports to stop landing on my desk every morning with like hundreds of young people
Yeah.
that have died basically. And so he does some things that are, they seem morally questionable, but it's all in the service of like he's trying to do the right thing. He's trying to save the most people that he can and just come out of this situation unscathed basically. So
Well, it's very much a balancing act between
yeah.
Starfleet ideals and what, best interest for Bajor, and especially as he starts to
Mhm.
take on the role of the emissary, and
Right.
actually come to terms with that. He really starts looking out for Bajor, and then also, yeah, looking for threats nearby. And even Q, notices that Cisco is a different kind of captain, because he's having this like boxing match with him. He's like, come on, come on, come on. And Cisco punches him in the face, and Q's just like, you hit me. Picard never hit me. So it's kind of like a joke in there to show that, yeah, he's not, I'm not Picard.
Well, it's funny because it's like they were doing that to try and distinguish it as its own show, but Cisco can be provoked.
Oh yeah.
That is a difference definitely between him and Picard. It is possible to provoke him. The Maquis situation actually brings out the worst in him. In a later part of the show as well, where he's like, you betrayed your uniform, you betrayed me, like and it becomes like this personal vendetta for him, to a point where he like fires a biological weapon on a Maquis colony and makes their like planetary atmosphere uninhabitable in order to like catch their leader and bring him to justice. So it's like, these are some definitely like harder to answer questions than things that they were dealing with on the Next Generation. And so that's one of the things I really like about it. I also like that it's really the only Star Trek show that acknowledges that religion exists at all in any form, and they don't really vilify it. They're just kind of like, well, this is how the Bajoran culture is, and they're different, and that's fine. And it's not like, well, these people are backwards. It kind of goes like, well, things like faith are still going to exist in the future. That's not going to go away just because we have advanced technology and we live in space and stuff like that. And I think that, again, that's another wrinkle. That's another thing for them to like discuss on the show that Star Trek really hasn't done a whole lot with so far. So, I don't know.
Except for Star Trek 5.
Yeah, except for Star Trek 5. Well, yeah, that's
you don't
true.
ask the Almighty for his ID.
Yeah, but I don't know. Deep Space Nine, if you can't tell, is my favorite of the Star Trek shows. I really love it. I really think that even though it was a series of them basically reverse engineering character decisions about their characters, going, okay, what we wrote before, we want to kind of course correct it, but we want it to make sense with what came before. Like the Dr. Bashir being genetically engineered, or even the change of like Nog wanting to enter Starfleet instead of being like this criminal kid that's running around the station. Like, those are all things that they didn't plan for initially, but they write them into the show and it feels so natural, like it was totally justified by what came before. So I think that's one of the most exciting things about this show, is just how many times it like reinvents itself and like moves in a different direction.
Yeah. And it certainly makes it enjoyable to rewatch even today, because it has those serialization aspects to it that, makes it very similar to what you would see today. So it's a lot easier to kind of go back and watch it versus something that's so episodic that it's like different from episode to episode. And you're like, wait, this traumatic big thing just happened in the last episode, and now it's like, we don't care. Whereas on Deep Space Nine, you get that continuity, and it feels a lot more modern that way, which they didn't know at the time, that we were going to have all this streaming and, binging wasn't really a word, except for, if you're talking about alcohol. So, it wasn't really a word to describe like TV. So now though,
I think one of the most interesting things is that it's found its audience now, really. Yeah. And because we talked to Nana Visitor, who played Kira Nerys on the show, at I think the only Star Trek convention I've been to with you in Chicago. And she said something to the effect of, it seems like now that the show's on Netflix, people are watching it and appreciating it. And she's like, it's so different because it wasn't like that when it was on. Like when we were doing these shows, like we felt like no one was watching it, like nobody cared. And now like some, 20 years after it ended, all of a sudden people are going like, wow, this is really good. So that's got to be a really strange experience for the actors, but also kind of rewarding that like eventually it did find its audience and it found like that group of people that enjoy it.
Yeah. So. I rewatched it about 2 years ago. And I definitely felt that like when it was on, I really liked it, and it did some mind-blowing things and, that were new in the 90s and, that was really neat. But like rewatching it recently, I just got a new appreciation for everything that they did in the show. And it just kind of like kicked it up a notch, essentially, of, where it is on my favorite Star Trek of all time. So that was a really fun experience to rewatch it again. So if you haven't seen Deep Space Nine, or if you have seen it, but it's been, years and years and years, You should go back and rewatch it because it gives you a new perspective watching it nowadays, and it's very accessible as opposed to, you know, some of the other Star Trek that's a little
Mhm.
harder to watch if you're not really that into it. But I think DS9 would probably be
Yeah.
the most accessible.
Yeah, it feels, if not completely like modern storytelling, it feels like it's moving in that direction. And
Yeah.
this wasn't the only show at the time that was experimenting with that. X-Files was experimenting with it. There were other television shows that were kind of like dipping their toe into like, hey, maybe we can do things that aren't just wrapped up in 1 or 2 episodes. But I don't know of any other show that had like 10 episodes in a row to be continued, like to end out their
Hmm.
series. Like that's pretty insane.
Except for
In that,
Babylon 5.
yeah, except for Babylon 5, exactly. But Babylon 5 was very much every episode is to be continued at a certain point. I mean,
Yeah.
I think you get to season 3 of that show and it's just like it's serialized now. Boom. There are no one-off
Hmm.
episodes. That's not going to happen anymore.
But everything
So,
was designed from the beginning of you can
right.
have something that was introduced in the first 5 episodes, not hear about it for 2 seasons, and now we're bringing it up again, and it's an important story element, you know, that we just saw as like something
Right.
originally. And it's like these seeds are sown very early on purpose, whereas Deep Space Nine was very much just after the fact of like, well, what if the entire time it was like this?
Mhm.
And, you know, now we're going to see the fallout from it. So
Yeah.
the payoff just is a little bit different, you know, doing it that way, but
Yeah, for
it
sure.
still lands, it still works.
Yeah.
Well, before we leave the Next Generation, we do have to talk about Star Trek Generations from 1994. So I must computer load the Star Trek The Next Generation bridge. Okay, now make it more dramatic for a movie. Ah, there we go.
Oh, there we go.
Everything has to be dramatic for the movie. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
somebody turned all the lights down.
yeah, that's well, and then when we get to the J.J. Abrams stuff, I mean, it'll basically just be a white background. You won't be
Yeah.
able to see me at all. It'll just be a lens flare in my face.
Yeah, so for Star Trek Generations, there are a lot of really important story things that happen, but we have basically talked about that movie for 2 hours already
Yeah,
in our season, I believe our season 2 two-part episode where we go over the movie adaptation comic. It's pretty much a one-to-one representation of what the movie storyline gives you with a few
with
beats
deleted scenes.
actually
Yeah,
added in. Yeah, so if you guys are interested to hear more about Star Trek Generations, you should just go back and check out that episode because I think we covered it pretty extensively and
yeah, I think so.
even talked about like how it affected stuff in the Star Trek card show. So,
Yep.
yeah. Yeah.
Oh, whoops! I had a Deep Space Nine thing in the Voyager section. The Dominion storyline was actually originally meant to span 2 episodes, and Ronald D. Moore and Ira Stephen Bear wanted to make the storyline ongoing, but Rick Berman said nah. And so
Wow.
he wanted to maintain that episodic format. But after Berman left to oversee the launch of Voyager, Moore and Bear were free to, you know, do what they want essentially at that time,
Yeah.
and they made the Dominion War a main plot of the show.
That was season 3. That's when the
Yeah.
show really like veered into, well, you're not here to stop us, Rick. So we're gonna, yeah, that's when Ira Stephen Bear was really the showrunner. So,
Yeah. Well, I guess I will load the load the Star Trek Voyager bridge.
all right. So 1995 to 2001 gives us Star Trek Voyager, and this is the last show, at least from my understanding, that at least came from a pitch that was Gene Roddenberry's. So don't know how much it was changed in the end result from what that was originally, but
Yeah.
this was at least something that had been pitched before he died, and they developed it into a series that also lasted 7 years. So the big, I guess, the elephant in the room to talk about is that we have Captain Catherine Janeway this time. So it's the first time that we have a female captain on Star Trek, which is a really big deal, you know, for the representation and everything. But they also were not really keen to explore a lot of similar ideas because this is now the 4th Star Trek series. So it's kind of like, let's push them into an area of space. Let's push them away from anything that we know so that we can kind of just do our own thing. And unlike other shows, Star Trek Discovery, that would try to do new things in the existing timeline by just writing whatever they felt like, they actually put Voyager somewhere else in the galaxy where the politics and the relationships and the things happening on the rest of Star Trek don't really matter because the ship is
Yeah.
lost 70,000 light years away.
Where no
So
one has gone before.
exactly. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Jerry Goldsmith did write the theme song for this show too. So he
Mhm.
was again brought in to be, the musical voice of Star Trek for at least the
Yeah.
opening credits for this. So
Well, and in the opening credits, so I read that the opening credits Voyager is completely CGI, and they used a model that was like 6 feet long for the first couple seasons, and then at some point they switched over to using CGI. So this was definitely a transition phase in the, practical to CGI effects, because Voyager ran till 2001, so we had a lot of explosive CGI, starting around the 2000 mark or so, when the world didn't end because of Y2K and all those little diskettes that you had that was like insert disk and update your clock before the clock strikes midnight, and it becomes 2000 and your computer explodes and loses everything because it can't process dates that are after 1999. But
we were worried about
survived.
that. We did survive. But this is Voyager is a really interesting show, and I think what I really take away from it overall is that this is going to be controversial to some people. I like it more than the Next Generation. The reason I like it more than the Next Generation is because even though they're still doing episodic, let's explore the galaxy type episodes, their characters are fully developed in the first episode. Like the very first episode, you know what Captain Janeway is about. You know that Harry Kim is kind of like a green ensign that's coming on board and doesn't really know what to expect, and then he's thrown into this unfamiliar situation. You know that Tom Paris is like an ex-con and he's kind of trying to get his way back to redemption, and you even meet Chakotay, like who's a Maquis captain, and but you kind of establish that like okay, he has a sense of honor, like he's trying to save people's lives and not just like this renegade crazy guy that's out there. And even like Tuvok and Janeway's friendship, that's laid out in the first episode. A lot of those important relationships. B'Elanna Torres, you really get what she's about early on in the show. I think it's the second episode where she gets promoted to chief engineer, which is a big deal because she was in the Maquis and all of that. So it's just the characters on this show, to me personally, are more interesting than the characters on the Next Generation. That doesn't mean I don't like the Next Generation. I love it. I think it's great. I think it's great that we got more of it. But I just think that the characters on Voyager are a little more fully fleshed out so that when we do start having these episodic adventures, they do have points of view and they do have perspectives that go beyond just, well, he's the guy that flies the ship or he's the guy that runs security. Like there's more to them than that. So
that's, I think, what really did it for me and made this show my favorite for so long was that, like, when I started becoming a Star Trek fan, I was, looking backwards to the original series and a lot of the movies and the Next Generation. And when Deep Space Nine and Voyager came out, it was like, this is the new Trek. And it's new to everyone, not just me. Like, I'm not going back and watching Star Trek that everyone else has seen. I'm seeing new things come out that no one else has seen before, and Voyager kind of feeling like an updated, newer version of the Next Generation, but also doing something different to where it didn't feel like we were repeating the same. We didn't have to have a Get Naked Now episode like we did in the original series, The Next Generation. We got to get away from those abandoned concepts and really just have a show that this is what we do and we're doing it this way and we don't have to repeat those things. And it really helped it be more solid right from the beginning, like you kind of mentioned, but also like being able to watch this from the beginning and see it as it came out was like, I think, huge to me, and it really made a big impact. And like all of the like really science lingo talk, in addition to the techno babble, in addition to like the strong female lead who's like a no nonsense, like, you've threatened the wrong woman. Like, I'm not going to stand for this and it's not going to happen. And I will fire torpedoes on you. And that's the way it's going to be. Like, she was just like, you will not mess with me. She like her and Cisco are kind of similar in that way. But I feel like Cisco is a lot more personable, whereas Captain Janeway is more like the the lady boss that's like, I respect you and you're very intelligent and I want to learn from you, but I'm also going to, you know, kind of step back and not get on your bad side, because if I do that, there's going to be consequences that I don't want to deal with. So I'm going to, you know, not walk on eggshells like a bad boss, but somebody that's like, again, I respect you, I like you, but I still want to stay on your good side because I don't want those torpedo launchers pointed at me.
Well, I think that's a very good way to explain it. Sisko is definitely more personable with his officers than Captain Janeway. She very intentionally established some distance, and she really keeps that in place, except with really Tuvok and Chakotay, I would say, are the people that really get like brought into her inner circle. But Tuvok, she was already friends with before the show started. Whereas, hey, there you go. Are you missing Tom Paris?
No,
and you're missing Neelix. And
I thought
Kess?
I had Neelix. Oh, I have Kess. Here's Kess.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, yeah, where's Tom Paris?
Yeah, so even I don't know. Even the alien characters on Voyager, I feel like are truly different.
You mean like, I am a Kazon, hear me roar. I am a Kazon, hear me roar. I am a Kazon. So just a little sidebar here. We had one of those big like camcorders, you know, that you would see in the 90s where it's like, you know, this huge to record a video. And it probably sounds crazy to people who've never seen one, but it was basically like we had these giant cassettes and you had to put a giant cassette into this giant player to record a video. But it was a big camera, so it made you feel like you were in a movie, filming a movie, because it was like this giant camera. So I had one of those somehow. I don't even know if we afforded it or it was a hand-me-down or we got it from a yard sale, but I had one. So I used it to, you know, just film various different things around the house, which was kind of fun. But then we had all these Star Trek action figures. And so we tried to create our own little Star Trek shows. So like my mom helped me make this bridge out of like little foam pieces. So we had little stations, and then we printed out, you know, Star Trek computer screens and then tape them on to the little foam pieces. And that way we could have all the figures, you know, and play them. They're not dolls, they're action figures.
Yes, they are. So anyway, multiple points of articulation.
Yes, they do. They can move their arms, they can bend their elbows, they can even bend their legs. And so that was the thing, is we got away from just regular Star Trek and we tried to do our own stuff. Like I had a Jem Hadar action figure and we created a talk show called the Jim Hadar Show. And so these are like lost episodes to time. But one thing we also did was we had the dancing Kazon, and the lyrics were just, I am a Kazon, hear me roar. And you would just shake the action figure, and that was the show.
That's probably how you play people out into the commercials, maybe. He comes on and does his dance.
And then
they'll be like, all right,
and then the next guest comes on.
We're going to commercial, folks. It was also hosted by Damon Wayans, because the action figure that they made of Captain Sisko looked more like Damon Wayans than Avery Brooks. And he was more in the public consciousness at the time, I guess, because of In Living Color and all that.
Yeah.
So, anyway,
but you can't find these episodes anywhere. They're not on YouTube. They might be on a VHS tape that I might have in storage somewhere, or it might have been taped over, or it might just be in the garbage. So no one will ever see these. And I hope that they never do.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go with that. Kind of hope it's been lost to time.
Even if I find it, you will never see it. So anyway.
Well, you were saying about how much you liked Voyager earlier before we kind of got into the sidebar.
Yeah.
And one thing I will say about Voyager is that it is the most consistent Star Trek show. It starts out and has a really strong first season, and the quality of it, while it dips a few times, like maybe like the latter half of season 3 is not super great. I think overall it stays really consistently the same level of quality all the way through. And that's pretty unique within Star Trek, because most of the shows, with the exception of like TOS, their first season is pretty rough. And even Deep Space Nine, which is my favorite, I've got to admit, there are episodes in the first season that make me groan, where I'm like, oh, can we just get through this?
And count to 10 and Talamarin. Yeah.
That's one of them. I mean, and the one where Vosh comes on board the station and she's like selling artifacts and stuff. I'm just like, I don't care. Like, this is next generation stuff, and it doesn't fit this show. So although it does have that part where Q is like a Bajoran waiter, and Dr. Bashir's like, dang, you're an impertinent waiter or something. That's funny. But yeah, but Voyager is, it's very much the Star Trek formula, but it's transplanted into another part of space, and it has characters that are like fully formed when the series starts. So we have plenty of times for like these characters to like grow and sort of explore who they are, and for the audience to find out who they are. And I think two of the more unlikely ones would be Paris and Torres, because they seem like they're just kind of like surface level, like, okay, he went to prison, but he's a great pilot. So he's like the hotshot pilot character that the network wanted, right? And like
Mm.
she's just like she's got a fiery temper, like that's what defines her. But they have this romance that like develops really naturally throughout the run of the show, and they actually allow the characters to like carry that through to marriage, and then eventually towards the end of the show they're like planning on having a child even. So it's like you really get to see these two characters from different worlds sort of develop this relationship, and it doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel like, oh, it's like a cheesy 90s TV thing. Although I will say they do need some relationship counseling, because most of the time when some like real admission comes out of them, it's because they're in some horrible crisis and about to die.
Yeah.
So maybe you shouldn't need that for your relationship to survive. But
But they're so
um,
busy, and it's basically
they
like
are.
because they're in the
Yeah.
Delta Quadrant, there is no
Right.
shore leave. There is no let's
Right.
take a break or a vacation, because you're pretty much always on duty and there's
Right.
nowhere to go.
Right. Yeah, it's true. I do wonder why every character on that show though is not just like they established like the holodeck open door policy in like season 6. I feel like Janeway should have done that in like the second episode.
Yeah.
Like, you guys are not going to get home probably within your lifetimes. Maybe everybody gets holodeck time and we all rotate through there, because that's like the only thing to like take them away from the day to day. Like, well, I work on a starship every single day of my life. Like,
Hmm.
I don't know. It seems like that would be like used even more than it is. But
Yeah.
they have the pool hall and they have like the luau thing that they do, and then they have Fairhaven where they go to like the Irish town. I think those are like the three big holodeck programs that they do.
Yeah, I think that was the
But
neatest idea of like, let's set up a town and basically just
mhm.
leave that program running, so that way people can just wander in and out, and we don't have to
Yeah,
worry about, well, I'm running this program and you want to run a different program and having those conflicts. It's like, let's just have it open and anybody can just come out here and have
yeah,
a drink or do whatever. Kind of like Hogwarts and Hogsmeade, where it's like you have a town where you can like
yeah,
visit regularly.
yeah.
But
That was pretty cool.
you
Sorry.
mentioned children, and maybe we should have talked about this during the Deep Space Nine segment, but
Oh
in
yeah.
in each series we have an actress who becomes pregnant, and we hide it through cinematography. So Gates McFadden, Dr. Crusher, is pregnant at one point, and then on Deep Space Nine, actually the actress for Kira, Nana Visitor, and the actor for Dr. Bashir, Alexander Siddig,
Mhm.
they get married actually, not on the show but in real life.
Yeah.
And so Nana becomes pregnant, and they actually work that into the storyline to where she's like a surrogate for Keiko and Miles, who are, due to a transporter accident, like Keiko's pregnant, and then it essentially, goes over to
They beam the
Kira.
baby into Kira
Yeah,
using the
basically.
transporter.
and and so like they worked it in, but then here we have Roxanne Biggs Dawson, who plays
Mhm.
B'Elanna Torres, and she becomes pregnant, and then we do that cinematography thing where it's like she wears like a baggier shirt, and you can kind of see a little bit sometimes where she's
Yeah.
walking through and she's wearing this baggy shirt, and you're like, well, that's kind of weird, but they were trying to hide it because they didn't, it wasn't time to work that into the story between B'Elanna and Paris.
Well, it's funny because she is actually pregnant towards the end of the series,
Yeah, and
but
then they had to fake it.
it's not at the point when the actress was actually pregnant in real
Yeah,
life. So
that's
that
right.
so that's very funny, because there is all this talk about them, like, oh, the baby's gonna look too Klingon, or like whatever,
Hmm.
she's worried about that, and that's a whole episode they do in the last season. But since then, Roxanne, Biggs Dawson has long since given birth and doing all that. So
Yeah,
so yeah, it had to be a fake baby bump at that point, which is
she had to
very
go like
funny.
back to it. Yeah.
But Voyager, I think besides the characters just being very rich and like being like I sort of like cared about them right away from the first episode. The other thing that it does really well is weird sci-fi, and I mean weird. Like they do stuff that is so much stranger than what they did on Star Trek: The Next Generation on Voyager. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, there's an episode where the entire crew is cloned by this sentient mass of like silver blood that's on a planet, and then that mass actually develops enough consciousness to like replicate the ship, and they fly out into space.
And they
And
think they
all of
are the
this,
original
yeah, they
crew.
think they are the original crew, and like that's the kind of stuff that you're signing up for with Voyager. Like
It
I
has a
think the
sad ending too.
yeah, oh it does.
Like they
Yeah.
just melt and then it's
They just
over.
evaporate
And
and that's
the
the end of
the
the
actual
episode.
Voyage crew is like, hey, we thought we detected something, but there's nothing there. Oh well, we move on. Like, oh,
It's
it was
like
so
what the
sad
heck?
because we spent the whole episode with these like liquid metal people that
I
we
know.
thought were the crew. So
But they yeah, I mean if you want to really see strange sci-fi stuff, that Voyager is definitely the Star Trek show that
yeah.
leans into that the most. I just off the top of my head, another weird one, the one where Chakotay is communicating with an alien species, and they switch on a gene in his brain that's like it's some genetic marker that could make him go crazy at some point in the future, but they're doing it so that he can like process their language, and so he's saying things like "You are too strange for us, too odd for us," and it's like these sentence fragments that are coming out, but he has, and it's all coming out through like a boxing simulation, and I don't know, it's very odd. But I mean, Voyager just they do great stuff with the characters, but then they also have the crazy sci-fi exploration
The
stuff. So if
macro
you,
virus
oh
with the
yeah, I
really
forgot
bad
about that.
CG, but it's like this giant like I don't know orifice thing with a stinger or
It's so
whatever.
gross. It
And then
gets mucus
when
on the
she
whole
like
ship.
clashes with it and then punches it, the CGI like even back then I think was pretty bad.
She puts a knife in it at one point, I think, and
Oh yeah, that's
but it yeah, like her she puts a lot of force behind it, but it kind of just like jiggles a little bit, like it doesn't move
yeah.
that much, and it's really yeah, it's really
Or
bad. But
or like phenomenon,
oh yeah,
phenomenon,
the
phenomenon.
the one where
Like
the
that was
ship
a
is literally being twisted inside out.
yeah. That like that was a cool episode, but the way that they did some of those like effects and dialogue lines where like Janeway is spouting nonsense and she's like, "It's doggy doo, it's candy," or something.
That's what it sounds like she's saying. Doggy do, it's candy.
Or something. But like it was a really cool sci-fi episode, but then there's like stuff like that
Yeah.
where the production, maybe a little
Hmm.
bit there made it kind of goofy, but the bizarre sci-fi concepts were definitely, and there was some like little time travel stuff here and there,
Hmm.
and there was some action sequences like the one with the macrovirus, like Janeway, she's got this tank top on uh under her uniform
It's
and it's like
basically Die
really hot.
Hard.
Yeah, it's like Die Hard where it's like really hot and she's just like sweating and she's got the compression rifle, I think from First Contact, which you shouldn't
Yeah.
have because they had different rifles when
Right.
Voyager started, so that was a continuity error, but they did at least keep the same uniforms because they changed
Yes.
from the Deep Space Nine style uniform, which I don't have here to show you, to this like different
Right.
Deep Space Nine style that has like the gray, and then the rank is actually the shirt underneath instead of the rank being the shirt
Right.
like this on top. But they couldn't change the uniforms for Voyager because they're on the Delta Quadrant. Who's going to let them know that there was a
Right.
wardrobe change? So they had to keep those the same. But some of the props, they
Hmm.
came on, so that was a thing, but not a big deal.
Right. I think overall Voyager does a really good job of fitting itself within continuity
Yeah.
without any of that stuff being a problem. They do run for a couple of years after Deep Space Nine has ended,
Hmm.
which is of course when the show starts to make more contact with home. So
Yeah.
that then they're able to kind of like, oh wow, we knew that like when they left, they knew that the Dominion existed, but they had no idea that there was a war fought. They knew that the Maquis existed. They had no idea that like they were all wiped out and killed. Like, and that
Hmm.
actually has an impact on the characters on this show because half the crew are Maquis.
Yeah.
Because in the opening episode, like half of the Starfleet crew are killed in this. I forget what it's called, a coherent tetryon beam. I think that I do remember what it's called, a coherent tetryon beam that knocks them into the Delta Quadrant that kills like half the crew. So it's funny because you're introduced to some of these characters in the first episode that are like kind of jerky, and you're like,
Yeah.
why do I care about these people? And then those are the ones that all die and get replaced by like Maquis people later. So
Hmm.
it's kind of funny
Little
because
too convenient.
they go out of their way to like make you hate the people that are not going to be regulars on the show.
Yeah.
But oh well, it's um, but yeah, it's a really good show. I think that it holds up pretty well as long as you just remember that it is still a product of that 90s syndicated time where they weren't trying to do a lot of hard serialization.
Yeah.
It really wasn't until they brought Seven of Nine on the show that they started to really lean into let's let's have longer storylines, and a lot of those involve the Borg because they're in the part of space that the Borg are actually from, or they involve just Seven's character herself and like her search for basically figuring out who she is because she was assimilated when she was a little child, so she doesn't even like have a fully developed like personality or anything.
Yeah. Well,
So
and that's one of the big controversies of Voyager was,
yeah.
unfortunately, you don't really see this on screen, but like, so Kate Mulgrew was really trying to, desexualize Star Trek in general because
Mm-hmm.
she didn't want her character Janeway to be seen as, this sex object. She is a Starfleet captain. She's in a serious role and, doesn't want that to change. So, obviously when we get this overly sexualized character like Seven of Nine, who's in this skin tight suit and, you can see all her curves, becomes the
Right.
new center of attention, that's really, completely against what Mulgrew was really wanting for her character in this show that, her character is the captain of. So she probably really feels a lot of, maybe not control, but a lot has been invested into this show. So there was a lot of
Right.
animosity between the two characters because you have this new character coming in who hasn't been with us for the past couple of years, and she's doing something that's completely contrary to the message that we're trying to send here, who's being forced on us, and we don't like this. So
Yeah.
there was a lot of butting heads behind the scenes. And later years, they've kind of reconciled for the most part. And, Mulgrew saying
Mm-hmm.
like, even though all of this stuff was happening, Jerry Ryan did a marvelous job in a very difficult role. So there's some, mutual respect there, but it
Yeah.
just like was one of those decisions like putting Worf on Deep Space Nine, absolutely best decision, worked out
He
really well.
fit
He
like
was
a glove. Yeah.
better there than in the Next Generation.
Mm-hmm.
But
Agreed.
putting Seven of Nine into Star Trek Voyager when it first happened seemed like it was really not going to be a very good idea. But fortunately, they moved away from the sort of, sexualization and gave her this really
Right.
great story arc, similar to Data, but her regaining her humanity because she was assimilated at a very young age. So the collective
Mm-hmm.
was all she had known. And she really never got to grow up as an adult human. So she had to kind of learn how to not just integrate into a society where she's no longer Borg, but also learn what it means to be human. And then she
Right.
also picks up some additional people that are not human, but they are Borg, and then they become, unassimilated, and they have to make this adjustment as well. And they're all trying to survive on the ship together that's in this,
Right.
undiscovered country of the Delta Quadrant. And so there's all these different things that are going on, and it really works out in the end until they
Yeah.
totally ruin it in Star Trek Picard by brutalizing Ichab, but we'll talk about that later. But
Yeah,
it was
well,
really
I
good on Voyager.
what I was going to say about Seven's character specifically is that they do continue with her on Picard, and they did one thing in season 3 of Picard that I think really saved how I look at the character on the later show, where she has a line where she's like, I had a family before. It was, basically in the Delta Quadrant, it was on Voyager. And somebody's like, oh, and you've been looking for that ever since. And she's like, yeah, exactly. Like we got back home and the crew broke up, and like that was her home. Earth isn't her
Yeah.
home. And I think that makes a lot of sense for her character. I think that's very logical given like what her character had been through and everything. And I think that that sort of put a band-aid on, maybe put a band-aid on like a brain hemorrhage, but it made me feel a little bit better about her character journey, where I was like, okay, she really is looking for that thing that she had on Voyager with Captain Janeway. And it's very interesting too, because Kate Mulgrew and Jerry Ryan have good on-screen chemistry. They
Yeah.
play off of each other extremely well. And whenever they have scenes together, it's you're watching two good actors,
Yeah.
like, you know,
You're like,
go
the
at it.
captain cares about her. She wants to
Exactly.
help her. Like, it's all
Yeah.
good things that you see on screen, but that was
hmm
not the way it was behind the scenes.
Yeah, so like their acting and their scenes together are actually really good. So I think that alone is like one reason why it was great to have her on the show, because it was
Mhm.
somebody for Janeway to sort of teach, but also to play off of and have conflict with, because you would think that that would be Chakotay, but by the time you get to like season 3 or so, he's pretty much calmed down, where he's not like really questioning her or going against her orders anymore,
Yeah.
because Janeway just won't stand for it. But
Right.
Seven is the kind of character that she's like, well, I'm not in Starfleet, I don't have to do what you say, like I'm just gonna.
I'm not scared of you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an episode where she even says, you encourage me to pursue my individuality, but then you get upset when it does not take the form that you want it to, or
Mm.
something like that. And I was like, that's such a great, like, Seven perspective, because
Yeah.
she's like, well, no, I'm becoming my own person. I'm not going to be just like you, Captain Janeway, you know? And I think that watching that journey is satisfying. The sexualization really is what they did with the camera. Like
Yeah.
that's honestly it's not really in the writing as much as it is like the camera work, and then like, oh, she's been injured, something's wrong with her cranial implant, so why is she on the biobed completely naked? I have no idea. But you know, with just like a sheet to like cover
Right.
or whatever, and like all those like tight shots on her, like while she's lying down and stuff, like it really was just the kind of skeevy camera work that did that. But I don't think that they wrote her in like a sexist way
No, her character
necessarily.
wasn't that way,
Yeah,
for
so
sure.
I don't know.
All right. Well, I think that will wrap up part 2 of our Star Trek discussion. So obviously we have a lot to say on Star Trek. Hopefully you're still here with
Yes.
us and you're awake. But join us next time for part 3, where we will finish out the Star Trek The Next Generation movies, and then talk about sort of the newer Star Trek of, well, Enterprise isn't really newer Star Trek, but the Kelvin timeline movies, like with Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto. We'll talk about the more recent shows of Discovery and Lower Decks and Strange New Worlds and Prodigy, and we'll see what's coming out, you know, for the future. So join us for part 3. It should be fun. Thanks for hanging with us.
Thanks for hanging.
With Lonnie Crawford. Yeah.